My name is Marian Ellison, and 3 months ago I was standing outside a family courtroom in Pensacola, Florida, watching my husband smile like he'd just won the lottery. His words are carved into my memory as sharply as a chisel biting into stone. "You'll never see the kids again. The beach house is already sold." He leaned close, his cologne stinging my nose, his smirk slicing me deeper than any judge's gavel ever could. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply smiled back, and he looked almost offended, as if he'd expected tears, maybe even a scene. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that I held a secret in my purse that would unravel every cruel word he'd just spoken. But before I can tell you about that letter, I need to take you back to the beginning, when my life still looked like the glossy picture of a marriage that had taken nearly 2 decades to build. Back then, if you asked anyone in our circle, they'd have said Marian and Graham Ellison had the kind of life most couples envied. 2 kids, Lydia and Tommy, both in private school. A husband who ran his own construction business. A wife who kept the books for local nonprofits. And the jewel in the crown, Aunt Ruth's beach house, a cedar-shingled place perched above the dunes of Navarre Beach, with wide decks that faced the Gulf. It wasn't just a house, it was a legacy, a promise Ruth left me when she passed, a reminder that the women in our family were made of tougher stuff than they looked. I remember the first summer after we moved in. The salt air would cling to the curtains, and Lydia would sprawl on the porch swing with a paperback, while Tommy, still a little boy, then built forts in the sand until the stars blinked on overhead. Graham grilled shrimp, beer in hand, playing the role of doting father. He looked the part. For years, I believed he was the part. But if you pay close attention, you learn that cracks in a marriage don't appear overnight. They whisper at first. The late phone calls answered in the driveway, the quick shutdown of a laptop screen when you walk into the room, the faint scent of cologne that isn't his on a jacket. It started around the time he began talking about refinancing the beach house. "Interest rates are at rock bottom, Mare," he'd say over breakfast. "We'd be fools not to leverage what we've got." I knew enough about numbers to be cautious. Aunt Ruth had drilled into me the difference between what you own free and clear and what a bank says you own. Still, Graham had a way of sounding like he was 2 steps ahead of everyone else, a man always working on the next smart move. He pushed papers across the table, sticky notes flagging where I just needed to sign. But I stalled. I told him I wanted to read the fine print to think it over. He laughed it off, kissed the top of my head, and said, "You and your details. Trust me, okay? That's what husbands are for." The warmth in his voice was beginning to sound more like cover than comfort. The kids noticed it too, though they didn't say it outright. Lydia started spending more time at friends' houses while Tommy hung closer to me, like he sensed something was unraveling. At dinner, Graham would talk about big jobs in Destin or Panama City, but when I asked why money seemed tighter, he brushed it off. "Cash flow, you wouldn't understand." And then came the locks. One weekend, we drove down to the beach house and Graham pulled a new set of keys from his pocket. "Upgraded security," he said casually. But I wasn't expecting the keypad at the back door, or the little black dome tucked high in the corner of the den ceiling. A camera. He waved it off. "Just making sure we're safe with the kids here and all." It wasn't safety I felt, it was surveillance. That night, I sat on the porch swing, Aunt Ruth's quilt across my lap, the sound of waves pounding the shore. I thought about her ledger books, the neat handwriting in columns, how she used to tell me, "Paper tells the truth long after people stop talking." I whispered those words into the salt air like a prayer, though I didn't yet understand how much I would need them. The unraveling picked up speed after that. I found transfers labeled Driftwood Dev LLC on our bank statements, but Graham said it was just a subcontractor. Then there was Sable Point MGMT, another name I didn't recognize. When I pressed, he rolled his eyes. "It's boring accounting stuff, Mare. Don't worry your pretty head." Pretty head. That was when I knew something had shifted. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was an obstacle. Still, I tried. I suggested counseling. I planned dinners. I even bought tickets to a concert we'd both loved in our 20s. He declined, said he was too busy, too tired. One night he came home late smelling of whiskey and muttered, "You'll thank me when it's all over." I didn't know what it was. And then, 18 months after the first strange phone call, I was sitting in that cold courtroom, the air heavy with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, as his lawyer painted me as unfit. Graham's expression never wavered. He played the role of wounded husband, shaking his head at fabricated bank records that made me look reckless. When the judge awarded him temporary custody and acknowledged the pending sale of the beach house, I thought my heart had stopped. The world tilted. Lydia's eyes filled with confusion. Tommy clutched the edge of my jacket. And then Graham delivered his cruelest line in the hallway. "You'll never see the kids again. The beach house is already sold." But instead of collapsing, I smiled. Not because I was numb, not because I was brave, but because inside my purse, tucked between a packet of tissues and a worn photograph of Aunt Ruth, was a letter he didn't know existed. A letter that would soon prove everything he thought he'd won was built on sand. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely crashes through your front door. It seeps in like damp under a floorboard, slow and silent, until one day you realize the wood beneath your feet has gone soft. That was how it happened with Graham and me. After the court hearing, my mind kept rewinding to the months before, replaying each odd detail, each raised eyebrow I'd ignored. I'd always been the numbers person in our marriage. Not glamorous, not flashy, just steady. I worked as a bookkeeper for a nonprofit that kept food pantries stocked. I liked balance sheets. I liked the way numbers told the truth. Graham, on the other hand, thrived on big gestures. He liked closing deals with a handshake, and a smile liked telling stories about his construction business over beers with friends. Where I was careful, he was bold. For years, that balance had worked. Until it didn't. It started with the bank accounts. I was sorting through our joint statements one evening while Lydia finished an essay at the kitchen table, and Tommy sprawled on the rug with a math workbook. I noticed a string of transfers labeled Driftwood Dev LLC. At first, I thought it was just another subcontractor, but the amounts didn't line up. Too neat, too regular, always near the end of the month. "Hey, what's Driftwood Dev?" I asked when Graham walked in, still in dusty jeans, smelling faintly of sawdust and aftershave. "Just a partner," he said without hesitation. "Helps with the bigger jobs." "Why?" I shrugged, sliding the papers into a folder. "Nothing. Just curious." He kissed the top of my head like I was a child interrupting grown-up talk. "Don't worry your pretty head." The words landed like a pebble in my stomach, rippling outward. Soon after, there was another name, Sable Point MGMT. When I called the bank to double-check, my teller friend hesitated before lowering her voice. "Marion, those are tied to something called an assignment of rents. You might want to look into it." Assignment of rents. I scribbled the phrase on a post-it and stuck it inside Aunt Ruth's old ledger. Later that night, I looked it up, learning that it meant income from a property could be redirected to another party, usually as collateral for a loan. My breath caught. The only property we had that could generate rent was the beach house. That weekend, Graham insisted we drive down. The kids piled into the back seat, Lydia scrolling on her phone, Tommy humming to himself. When we arrived, I felt a jolt. The back door had a new keypad lock. Inside, tucked high in the den corner, a small black dome glinted. "Security upgrades," Graham said casually, tossing his keys onto the counter. For what I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He grinned without looking at me. Better safe than sorry. But it didn't feel like safety. It felt like surveillance. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat on the porch swing, Aunt Ruth's quilt wrapped around my shoulders. The Gulf wind carried salt into my lungs, and the sound of the surf pounded in rhythm with my heart. I thought about Ruth, about the way she'd kept every receipt, every deed, every letter tucked into accordion files labeled in her tidy hand. She'd once told me paper tells the truth long after people stop talking. I whispered it aloud like an anchor. Things escalated quickly after that. Graham became more insistent about refinancing. He brought home papers marked with bright sticky tabs where I was supposed to sign. "Why the rush?" I asked one evening, sliding the forms back across the table. He leaned forward, his smile thinning. "Because interest rates won't stay low forever. You think I'm doing this for me? I'm doing it for us, for the kids." "For the kids," I echoed. "Then why isn't my name anywhere on this paperwork?" His chair scraped against the tile as he stood. "Because you complicate things, Marianne. Always dragging your feet. Always suspicious." The words stung. I'd spent years trusting him, managing our lives quietly in the background while he played the confident provider. Now I was suddenly the problem. The children noticed the tension. Lydia started volunteering for every study group, every sleepover. Tommy lingered in my orbit, more asking questions he shouldn't have had to ask at his age. "Mom, why's Dad so mad all the time?" I smoothed his hair, forcing a smile. "Sometimes grown-ups carry heavy loads, sweetheart. It's not about you." But inside I was unraveling. Then came the day I finally opened Aunt Ruth's file cabinet. It had sat untouched in the back of the closet since she died, a dented metal box with a stiff lock. I slid the key into the slot and lifted the lid, the smell of old paper rushing out like a ghost. Inside were folders labeled with her neat handwriting: property trust, banknotes, insurance letters. On top of the stack was a document stamped with a notary seal: Land Trust Agreement, 1999. My heart quickened as I scanned the lines. The property wasn't in Graham's name, or even mine. It was held by Gulf Breeze Land Trust, with me listed as sole trustee. The beneficiaries weren't us as a couple. They were Lydia and Tommy through a college fund trust. At the bottom, Aunt Ruth's signature glowed in faded ink. And there was a clause underlined: quiet survivorship property cannot be encumbered or conveyed without trustees' direct approval. I pressed my hand over my mouth, dizzy. Graham could bluster, he could threaten, he could even forge, but he couldn't legally sell that house without me. That night, after the kids were asleep, I tucked the trust documents into a fresh folder, slid them into my purse, and whispered, "Paper tells the truth." The next morning, as I poured coffee, a courier knocked at the door. He handed me an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a photocopy of a quitclaim deed. At the bottom, in shaky, crooked ink, was my own forged signature, transferring the beach house to Driftwood Dev LLC. My knees buckled. Graham thought he'd already won. When people tell you family court is about justice, don't believe them. It's not about justice. It's about paperwork, perception, and who has the sharper lawyer. By the time Graham filed for divorce, the stage had already been set. His attorney, a slick man named Douglas Kirkland, with cufflinks that glittered like coins, walked into the courtroom as if the outcome was inevitable. The courthouse smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The ceilings were too high, the benches too hard, and the judge, an older woman with silver hair pulled back into a bun, had the kind of eyes that made you feel she'd already decided which of you was lying. Graham sat across the aisle, expensive suit, pressed hair combed just so, looking like the picture of responsibility. He even had the nerve to glance at me with that same smirk he'd worn the day he installed the keypad lock at the beach house. Douglas stood and began weaving a narrative I barely recognized. According to him, I was careless with money, emotionally unstable, and negligent with the children. He produced bank statements I'd never seen before, showing online gambling charges in my name. He called witnesses neighbors, even a former babysitter who swore they'd seen me losing control. Each lie landed like a stone in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout the truth. But my lawyer, a tired man named Carl with coffee stains on his tie, kept putting his hand gently on my arm, whispering, "Stay calm, Marian. Let me handle it." When it was my turn on the stand, my voice shook. "Mrs. Ellison," Douglas said smoothly, "can you explain why your signature appears on this quitclaim deed, transferring the Navarre property to Driftwood Dev LLC?" I looked at the document on the screen, the blown-up signature glaring back at me like an accusation. "That isn't my handwriting," I said firmly. "I never signed that." Douglas arched an eyebrow. "So you're suggesting this legal document notarized and filed with the county is a forgery?" "I'm saying it's not mine," I replied, my hands gripping the edge of the witness box. He smiled as if I'd just confessed to something absurd. "Interesting." The judge scribbled notes, her face unreadable. The custody portion was even worse. Douglas painted Graham as the stable provider, the father with steady income and a support system. Me, I was described as anxious, overly controlling, financially reckless. When the ruling came, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Graham was awarded temporary custody of Lydia and Tommy. I was granted supervised visitation every other weekend. The judge acknowledged the pending sale of the beach house, noting it as a marital asset subject to division. I sat frozen, the words blurring together. Supervised visitation, pending sale. It was like watching my life get carved apart with a scalpel, each piece handed to the man who had orchestrated the whole charade. Outside the courthouse, the sun was blinding. I stumbled down the steps, the heat pressing against my skin. Graham caught up to me, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete. He leaned close, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You'll never see the kids again," he whispered, satisfaction dripping from every word. "The beach house is already sold. Enjoy your little rental apartment." And then he laughed. Actually laughed. Something inside me went very still. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked at him, held his gaze, and smiled. Because in my purse, tucked between a packet of tissues and a photo of Aunt Ruth, was the land trust agreement. Paper that told the truth long after people stopped talking. That night in my apartment, I spread everything across the kitchen table. Aunt Ruth's trust, the forged quitclaim deed, bank statements with phantom charges. I ran my fingers across the embossed notary seal, the signature that wasn't mine. My mind ticked through the details the way it always had when balancing books. Except this time the numbers weren't just about money. They were about survival. I could hear Aunt Ruth's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. "Don't shout. Don't flail. Use the paper. Paper tells the truth." So I began organizing. First, I made copies of the trust agreement. Then I printed every questionable bank record I could access online. I used sticky notes, highlighters, and tabs just like Ruth had. I created a binder labeled Ellison v. Ellison Evidence. The kids' faces stared at me from a photo propped against the salt shaker, Lydia's thoughtful brown eyes, Tommy's gap-toothed grin. My throat tightened. They were worth every ounce of fight I had left. A week later, I got a letter from Graham's attorney demanding I vacate the beach house entirely. It was addressed to Mrs. Ellison, occupant. The word stung. Occupant. As if I were nothing more than a squatter in the home Ruth had left me. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened a fresh notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote one sentence in bold letters. "He doesn't know what I know." And that, I realized, would be my advantage. The binder sat on my kitchen table like a weapon no one else knew existed. But even weapons need allies, and the longer I stared at the forged documents, the more I knew I couldn't win this fight alone. Graham had money influence, and a lawyer who could turn lies into gospel. All I had was a stack of papers and the faint echo of Aunt Ruth's voice reminding me that paper told the truth. One night, while sorting through Ruth's old ledger books again, I noticed something odd. Between the pages of the 2005 tax receipts, there was an envelope yellowed with age. My name, Marion, was written on the front in Ruth's looping handwriting. My breath caught as I slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a letter folded neatly in thirds. "If you're reading this, Marion, it means the house has become more than a home. It's become a battlefield." The words blurred for a moment as tears filled my eyes. Ruth had known. Somehow she'd anticipated this day. She went on, "I placed the house in a land trust, not just to protect it from creditors, but to protect you from anyone, including a husband, who might try to take it from you. If someone ever claims otherwise, remember the original deed and trust are recorded in Escambia County under Gulf Breeze Land Trust. No transfer can override it without your approval as trustee. Don't let anyone bully you out of what is rightfully yours and your children's. And Marion, don't be afraid to fight dirty if you must. The men of this world often underestimate the quiet strength of women. Let that be your advantage. I pressed the letter to my chest, the faint smell of cedar and old paper clinging to it. Ruth had handed me more than advice. She had handed me a roadmap. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer recommended by a friend from church, a woman named Andrea Sanchez. She was younger than Carl Sharper, with eyes that missed nothing. As I laid out the trust documents, the forged quitclaim deed, and Ruth's letter, Andrea's eyebrows arched higher and higher. "This," she said, "finally tapping the land trust agreement changes everything." I leaned forward. "But the judge already—" Andrea held up a hand. "Temporary rulings can be challenged if there's evidence of fraud. And this," she tapped the forged deed, "is fraud. Serious fraud." The tightness in my chest loosened just slightly. Still, Graham wasn't making things easy. He started sending me texts dripping with contempt. "Kids are adjusting fine without you. Hope you're enjoying your little apartment. House sold faster than I thought. Easy money." Each message was like a knife twist, but I forced myself to respond only with silence. He thrived on reaction. I wasn't going to feed him anymore. Instead, I doubled down on preparation. Andrea filed motion subpoenas, requests for financial discovery. She advised patience, telling me the wheels of justice turn slowly, but I could feel Ruth urging me forward. "Don't shout. Don't flail. Use the paper." In the meantime, I tried to keep my visits with Lydia and Tommy as normal as possible, even though the supervised label felt like a slap. A social worker sat in the corner of a sterile office while I tried to make small talk, sliding sketch pads toward Brina and puzzle books toward Tommy. Lydia was distant at first, her teenage eyes wary, but I saw the flicker of relief when I asked about her classes. Tommy clung to my arm, whispering, "When can we go home, Mom?" "Soon," I promised, even though I wasn't sure. Soon. When the visit ended, I kissed their foreheads and smiled for them, but inside I was a storm. One evening, Andrea called me with an update. "We pulled county records," she said, her voice brisk. "The beach house is still held under Gulf Breeze Land Trust. No sale has been finalized. No deed has been lawfully recorded. What Graham filed is smoke and mirrors." Relief flooded me, hot and dizzying. "So he can't sell it?" "Not legally," Andrea confirmed. "But Marion, that means he's either delusional enough to think forged documents will hold up, or someone's helping him. Either way, this could open him up to criminal charges." I sank into a chair, Ruth's letter still on the table beside me. Then maybe it's time we turn the tables. The turning point came a week later. I was sorting through another box of Ruth's papers when I found a flash drive taped to the bottom of a file folder. Inside were scanned copies of every trust amendment, every notarized document, every property tax receipt going back 20 years. Ruth had digitized everything. Andrea's eyes lit up when I showed her. "This is airtight. He doesn't stand a chance." For the first time in months, I felt something like hope. Of course, Graham didn't know any of this. To him, I was just the woman he'd humiliated in court, the wife he'd discarded, the mother he thought he could erase. He strutted around like a man who'd won. But I smiled when I thought of his arrogance. I smiled because Ruth had left me more than a house. She had left me a shield, a sword, and a strategy. And I was just beginning to use them. The morning of the evidentiary hearing, the courthouse lobby buzzed with the low hum of whispered conversations and the squeak of shoes on polished tile. Graham stood by the elevators in a tailored navy suit, his lawyer Douglas at his side, both of them radiating smug confidence. I caught Graham's eye for the briefest second. He smirked again, that same smirk he'd worn when he hissed, "You'll never see the kids again." I didn't flinch. I didn't smile either. Not yet. Andrea walked beside me, her binder stacked high with exhibits, her heels clicking in steady rhythm. "Remember, Marion," she whispered, "we don't need theatrics. We have the paper. Let the documents do the talking." We entered the courtroom and the bailiff called everyone to order. Douglas went first, repeating his well-polished narrative. According to him, Graham had responsibly managed marital assets while I had been erratic and reckless. He waved around the quitclaim deed like it was gospel, presenting it as proof the beach house was already conveyed to Driftwood Dev LLC. When it was Andrea's turn, she rose calmly, her voice smooth but sharp. "Your Honor, before we proceed any further, I'd like to submit into evidence the original land trust agreement for the Navarre Beach property, recorded in 1999, with my client, Marion Ellison, named as sole trustee. Additionally, I submit certified copies of tax receipts amendments and the trust's digital archive, all of which confirm the property cannot be conveyed without her direct approval." The judge adjusted her glasses as Andrea placed the thick stack on her bench. Douglas sputtered. "Objection. This is irrelevant." Andrea cut him off, her tone icy. "Irrelevant, Mr. Kirkland. Your client presented a forged quitclaim deed as valid. That is fraud. This is not only relevant, it is damning." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Kirkland, sit down." For the first time, Graham's smirk faltered. Andrea pressed on. "Your Honor, we are also submitting a handwriting analysis prepared by a licensed expert comparing Mrs. Ellison's signature to the one on the alleged quitclaim deed. The conclusion is clear: the signature was forged. Furthermore, county records show no lawful transfer has taken place. The Navarre property remains in the Gulf Breeze Land Trust, with Marion Ellison as trustee." The judge flipped through the exhibits, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This is troubling." "Troubling," Andrea repeated, leaning forward. "Your Honor, this is a calculated attempt to defraud the court and deprive my client and her children of their rightful home. We ask that custody and asset rulings be revisited immediately given the fraudulent basis of Mr. Ellison's claims." The courtroom went still. I could hear my own heartbeat, heavy and insistent. Graham shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He whispered something harsh to Douglas, who shook his head as though even he couldn't spin this into something clean. When Graham finally spoke, his voice was brittle. "She's twisting things." Andrea didn't let him finish. "No, Mr. Ellison. You twisted things when you tried to sell a house that never belonged to you. You twisted things when you forged your wife's name. And you twisted things when you told her she'd never see her children again." Every word landed like a hammer. The judge looked up sharply. "Mr. Ellison, I will remind you that this court does not look kindly on fraud. We will recess for review, but I can tell you now the evidence is compelling." When the gavel struck, Graham's mask cracked. He stormed out into the hallway, Douglas scrambling behind him. I followed at a distance, Andrea at my side. He spun on me near the elevators, his face flushed with fury. "You think you've won? You think this changes anything? The kids are mine, Marion. They want to be with me." I met his glare and for the first time let my smile show. The kids want stability. And now the court knows who's been lying to give them anything but that. His mouth opened, then shut again. The elevator dinged and he stepped inside without another word. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the binder open, Ruth's letter beside it. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to believe that maybe, just maybe, the tide had turned. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Graham was cornered, and a cornered man is dangerous. I could feel the storm gathering still. So I whispered the same words I'd clung to since the beginning: paper tells the truth, long after people stop talking. And I promised myself I would see this fight through no matter what it took. I thought the hearing would cool Graham down, maybe scare him into retreat. I underestimated him. A week later, I came home from the grocery store to find my apartment door slightly ajar. The lock had been forced. My stomach dropped. Inside drawers were yanked open, papers strewn across the floor, the binder gone. My pulse hammered in my ears. I called the police, but the responding officer's tone was weary. Looks like a burglary. Probably kids. Hard to say. Kids don't take binders full of legal documents. I sat on the couch, shaking Ruth's words echoing in my head. Don't be afraid to fight dirty if you must. Whoever had done this, they hadn't gotten everything. The originals were still safe filed, notarized unshakable. The copies were gone, yes, but paper told the truth, and the truth still lived in county records. Still, I felt exposed, watched. 2 days later, Andrea called. We need to talk. Urgent. In her office, she slid a manila folder across the desk. We subpoenaed Driftwood Dev's records. You'll never guess who owns it. I opened the file. My breath caught. Graham's sister Denise. Andrea's voice was calm but laced with steel. He didn't just try to steal the beach house. He roped in family to launder the paperwork. This is bigger than a bad divorce, it's fraud conspiracy. Possibly criminal. I sank back in my chair. So what happens now? We push harder, Andrea said. The court can't ignore this. But Marion, you need to be ready. When men like Graham realize they're losing, they get reckless. Her words proved prophetic. The following weekend, during a supervised visit with Lydia and Tommy, I saw it in their faces, the strain. Lydia's shoulders hunched defensively, her eyes tired. Tommy clung to me, whispering, Dad says you're trying to take everything from us. He says you're mean. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to cry. Sweetheart, the truth will come out. Dad's angry right now, but I love you. That never changes. Lydia's hand brushed mine, quick and tentative, like she wanted to believe me, but wasn't sure she could. The social worker cleared her throat, reminding us our time was nearly up. When the door closed behind them, the ache in my chest was unbearable. They were pawns in a game they didn't choose to play. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Ruth's old chair, staring at the gulf of darkness outside my window, thinking about how far this had spiraled. My life had been dismantled piece by piece, marriage, home, children. And yet, through Ruth's foresight, I still had one weapon. Graham didn't expect the truth in writing, the kind of truth that outlives lies. I whispered to the empty room. You didn't know, Graham. You never knew. And that's why you'll lose. The final hearing came on a rain-soaked Tuesday. Thunder rolled in the distance as if the sky itself wanted to bear witness. I walked into the courtroom with Andrea carrying a fresh binder, every page tabbed, highlighted, ready. Douglas looked pale. Graham looked worse. His jaw tight, his eyes darting. He knew the walls were closing in. Andrea presented the subpoenaed documents, the proof of Denise's involvement, the chain of fraud. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. When it was over, the judge leaned back, her expression grave. Mr. Ellison, this court has no tolerance for fraud. Custody will be revisited immediately. The Navarre Beach property is hereby confirmed as held in trust under Mrs. Ellison's sole authority. Furthermore, this matter will be referred for criminal investigation. The gavel came down like thunder. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in a year. Graham slumped in his chair, his face drained of color. For once, there was no smirk, no whispered threat. Only silence. Afterward, in the hallway, Andrea squeezed my arm. You did it, Marion. You fought back. I nodded, tears blurring my vision. No, I whispered, clutching Ruth's letter inside my purse. Ruth did. She saw it coming. She made sure I had the truth. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling across the courthouse steps. I lifted my face into it, letting the warmth wash over me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about winning. It was about surviving. And survival meant the fight wasn't truly over until my children were back in my arms. The weeks after the final hearing felt strangely quiet, like standing in the eye of a storm after months of chaos. The court had ruled in my favor. The beach house was safe. The fraud had been exposed. But victory in a courtroom doesn't automatically heal the wounds carved into a family. Lydia and Tommy came home slowly, like deer testing the air after being spooked. The first night they stayed with me, Lydia kept her backpack slung over her shoulder until I gently said, "Sweetheart, you can put it down. You're home." She hesitated, then dropped it by the stairs, her eyes flickering with relief and caution all at once. Tommy clung to me tighter than ever. "You're not gonna leave, right?" I knelt holding his face in my hands. "Never. Not ever. I fought for you because you're my heart, Tommy. You and your sister are everything." His little arms wrapped around my neck, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe we could begin again. Of course, Graham didn't disappear. He couldn't. He showed up to visitation sullen, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. He claimed he'd been tricked, that Denise had misled him, that he never meant for things to go so far. But I saw through it. Men like Graham didn't accidentally forge deeds and lie under oath. What struck me most wasn't his excuses, it was his shock that I'd fought back and won. He'd built his power on the assumption that I would break quietly, that I'd retreat in shame. He never expected Ruth's foresight. He never expected the paper. The beach house itself became a symbol not just of survival, but of inheritance. I took Lydia and Tommy there one golden afternoon in late spring. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen, just as it had when Ruth was alive. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. "This house isn't just a house," I told them as we stood on the deck overlooking the dunes. "It's part of who we are. Aunt Ruth wanted it to belong to you, to your future. That's why I fought so hard to protect it." Lydia slipped her hand into mine, her teenage reserve softening for a moment. "Thanks, Mom," she said quietly. "I didn't understand before, but I do now." Tommy ran ahead, his laughter tumbling down to the beach below, and in that sound I heard the promise of healing. Some nights I still dream about the courtroom, about Graham's smirk, about the words he spat. "You'll never see the kids again. The beach house is already sold." They echo like thunder in the back of my skull. But then I wake, and I see Lydia's art supplies scattered across the dining table, Tommy's sneakers kicked off by the door. I hear their voices in the kitchen, alive and close. And I know the truth, he was wrong. He didn't know the whole story. He didn't know Ruth had prepared me. He didn't know that sometimes the quietest strength is the hardest to break. If you've listened this far, maybe you've faced battles of your own fights. You never asked for betrayals you never expected. Maybe you've been underestimated too. I want you to remember something Aunt Ruth taught me. Paper tells the truth long after people stop talking. In other words, the truth has a way of surviving even when lies scream louder. So hold on to it. Fight for it. And when someone tells you it's over, when they mock you in the hallway of life's courtroom, smile. Smile, because maybe, just maybe, you hold something they don't know. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Leave a comment about a time you or someone you love stood up against impossible odds. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilient survival and quiet victories, subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you need to be.